Okay, I'm going to thank you, first of all, for having me here. Thanks to Richard and everyone else. This is actually relieving for me because I get to do this in English. Usually I'm giving presentations in Chinese. I've been living in Shanghai for the past 14 years and sort of have come to consider myself as a very, very pale Chinese. Now, nice to be back in sort of English for a little bit. I'm originally an architect. You'll see a slide up there, but I don't practice anymore. We're very well known for doing impossible projects in impossible locations. We did things like the first carbon neutral hotel in Asia, the first LEED platinum resort in the world, regenerating old sites into ecological sites, largest rammed earth structure in the world. In a lot of the greenest projects, net zero projects and so on in China, the last place people expect to be doing this kind of work. Next, please. I have a lot of slides, so I'll be running through this quite quickly.
Raefer, I'm going to interrupt.
No worries. Our biggest issue has always been materials. Whenever we're looking at green, it always comes down to this question of building materials. So ask me about this later, please. It ends up obviously in our food. Next. Comes in through our skin. Next. And ends up in the air we breathe. A lot of research on this. Ask me about this later as well. Next. Next. Yeah, we can skip this. So at the end of the day, all the building materials end up in our children. You can ask me about this later as well. Done a lot of research here and helps explain why we become a little bit obsessed about this topic of building materials. Next. So two things that you might want to pick my brain about today. One, cloud software. I no longer do architecture. I build software for some of the world's largest developers, some governments, and some of the world's largest design firms as well, and focusing on healthy building environments. Next. So here's an example of the database that we build. Next. Material management software. Next. And then we also run a green building certification program that spins off of all of this. So we really run a mix of social enterprise versus nonprofit versus for-profit to fund it. You can ask me about that later as well. Next. Things to talk about to the Green Building Council as well as to invest. How do you use building material disclosure as a new economic or a new piece in a local economy? This is a very up-and-coming topic that somebody needs to take a lead on. The US right now and Europe. No one in Asia is taking the lead on this. There's a huge opportunity in building material disclosure that gets localized. Ask me about this later. Next. Some apps, the certification that we run requires building material disclosure. It also requires real-time monitoring. So we just launched this app. It's the first app in the world to track indoor air quality. Now mostly in China, we track things like schools, how healthy are the kids inside. Next. Next. You can ask me, skip that paparazzi slide. Next. Next. Now, the two things that I'd like to be a little bit disruptive on is we're always talking about green, sustainability. I'd like to dump those two topics. Next, please. Because they're both imports. They're Western ideas. And it took me 5 years in China to realize I was banging my head against the wall. This is where I grew up. It's an environment of ecology. So when you talk about protecting the environment, the default is protecting the ecology. And it spins off this whole idea of green building and sustainability, which is super not Asian. Asia is a culture of health. So next, please. We actually, in 2008, abandoned this. It was a waste of time in Asia because it doesn't speak to the culture. And we took this on. We started talking about people's health, and then we started hitting a sensitive chord. Asia is a culture of regeneration, not a culture of sustainability. And that has made a huge difference in the amount of impact that we've had over the past few years. Next, please. So, regeneration. What does that look like? Next. We start with sites like this, which, let's face it, this is what most of our sites look like. Next. Graphically, this is what they look like. Next. And we start looking at buildings as a good thing. I want to build not less buildings, not less density. I want to build more buildings and as much density as possible. I'm a big fan of putting buildings where we're not supposed to put buildings. Why? Because we can use them for good. So here, standard, if I displace the building and I replant on the top, I've used the building to create ecology. I've 100% of the footprint. Next. If I'm a slightly better designer and a bit creative, I can use the building to create 125%. More ecology with a building than without. And these are very, very simple guidelines that can be implemented. Next. There's a million projects out there. I'm just showing my own because we're closest to them. And like I said, I don't design anymore. But taking things like this, devastated sites, next, and regenerating them for profit. This is an eco-retreat from an industrial site. Yes. Next. Then looking at scale. How do you do this? How do you take a hotel in Shanghai and restore the wetlands? Next. So a lot of the green conversation is here. It's about how do I take the bad things I do when I need to build a tower next to the ocean in Penang. That's bad. How do I take that bad thing and make it minimized? How do I reduce, reuse, recycle, right? I want to introduce a new R, and that's restorative or regenerate. How do I use a building to create good? Because there's actually nothing wrong about building a tower next to the ocean if you do it right. It can actually help fix a lot of problems. It's just a question of the incentives that get implemented or the guidelines that get put in place to take people away from this kind of thinking into regenerative thinking, where we want as many buildings as possible. Next. Now, we've been a huge part of bringing the world's best practices to Asia. So how do you, ask me about this later. Things like the Living Product Challenge, starting with building materials. Next. Taking it to the Living Building Challenge. These are buildings that are designed to work like nature, that produce more water than they consume, produce more energy than they consume. Buildings that work like trees. Next. And then taking it up to the living communities, so entire cities, and these are studies that have been done for San Francisco, for example, Seattle, and now starting to come to Asia as well. So quiz me about that later. Next. Software. Impossible to do anything for software, which is why I quit architecture and went into software, because I was tired of doing all these amazing projects which were just a drop in the ocean. Wanted to look at how you scale this. So taking this to software is imperative for any kind of scale. And I do think Penang has a huge opportunity here, because I travel around the world, and what I see here is, yes, there's leisure, but there's also a manufacturing industry that's still there, and now a hunger for software as well. So you have three parts there that should be capitalized on. Next, and I'm almost done. So, building a healthy material economy as opposed to a green material economy, using software to do that. Ask me about that later. Next. Healthy project economy. This is an example of a project that does more good than bad. You want more buildings like this. Ask me about it later. And on all the way to a healthy city economy. How do we transform Penang to hit these standards? Next. So, as opposed to focusing on green, I'm just left with two thoughts. How do I focus on my health, because it's personal, and then what does that mean locally? So, my health, my Penang type of an idea. Thank you.
This is why Raefer is one of my 11 heroes in this room. Any questions for you? You made it, right? Questions for Raefer? Because you can also speak to him next. Great, thank you. Professor Gao Yan, you're next.